A golden age of progress, prosperity, and dangerous certainty. At the dawn of the new century, the world stood tall with confidence unmatched in human history. Smoke no longer symbolized destruction, it signaled progress. Factory chimneys rose like monuments to human ingenuity, stretching across Europe and North America, while railroads stitched continents together with iron veins. Cities glowed at night under electric lights, banishing centuries of darkness and fear. For the first time, humanity believed it had mastered not only nature, but destiny itself. The Industrial Revolution had transformed societies at a breathtaking pace. What once took months could now be done in days. What once required thousands of hands could be achieved by machines humming tirelessly. Steel, coal, and oil powered an economic engine that seemed unstoppable. In cities like New York, London, Chicago, and Berlin, skyscrapers pierced the sky, symbols of ambition and belief in an ever-rising future. To many, this was not merely progress, it was proof that civilization had reached its safest, most advanced stage. Global trade flourished like never before. Steamships crossed oceans with predictable precision, carrying goods, people, and ideas between continents. American grain fed Europe, Asian textiles filled Western markets, African resources fueled industrial expansion. Stock markets boomed, banks expanded, and fortunes were built almost overnight. A growing middle class emerged, convinced that hard work and innovation guaranteed stability and upward mobility. Newspapers celebrated growth, economists praised interconnected markets, and politicians promised prosperity without end. This interconnected world created a powerful illusion that economic dependence would make war obsolete. The logic seemed simple and reassuring. Why would nations destroy trading partners they relied upon? Why would leaders risk prosperity for chaos? Many intellectuals of the era argued that large-scale conflict had become irrational, even impossible. Civilization, they claimed, had evolved beyond such barbarism. Progress was not just technological, it was moral. Politically, the great powers projected an image of stability and control. Empire stretched across maps in bold colors, giving the impression of order and permanence. Diplomatic summits, treaties, and alliances reassured citizens that leaders were managing global tensions responsibly. In the United States, optimism ran deep. The nation had emerged as an industrial powerhouse, confident in its democratic institutions and economic strength. Across the Atlantic, Europe's old empires believed centuries of experience had taught them how to balance power without catastrophe. Yet, beneath the surface, this golden age was far more fragile than it appeared. The same industrial systems that created wealth also bred inequality. Factory workers labored long hours in dangerous conditions, their lives reduced to numbers in production ledgers. Rapid urbanization produced overcrowded neighborhoods where poverty and disease thrived just blocks away from luxury. While elites spoke of progress, millions struggled to survive within the very system that claimed to uplift humanity. Discontent simmered quietly, rarely reaching the polished speeches of those in power. National pride, amplified by industrial success, began to harden into nationalism. Each nation measured its worth not only by prosperity, but by strength, economic, military, and cultural. Technological advances that powered factories also fueled arms production. Battleships grew larger, rifles more efficient, artillery more devastating. Military parades became public spectacles, celebrated as symbols of security rather than warnings of destruction. The line between preparedness and provocation blurred. Faith in reason and science further deepened the era's dangerous certainty. Innovations in medicine reduced mortality rates. Engineering conquered landscapes once thought impassable. If science could defeat disease and distance, why couldn't it prevent war? Many believed that rational leaders, guided by data and diplomacy, would always choose stability over destruction. This confidence left little room for doubt or humility. The press played its role in reinforcing the illusion. Newspapers praised national achievements, glorified technological marvels, and downplayed international tensions. Stories of diplomatic disagreements were framed as temporary misunderstandings, easily resolved by capable statesmen. The public consumed these narratives eagerly, comforted by the belief that history's violent chapters had been closed for good. Education systems echoed the same message. Schools taught children that they lived in an enlightened age, far removed from the ignorance and brutality of the past. Museums displayed artifacts of ancient wars as relics of a less civilized time. The idea that modern society could collapse into chaos seemed almost laughable, a relic of outdated thinking. But progress created complexity, and complexity bred vulnerability. Global trade meant global dependence. A disruption in one region could ripple across continents. Alliances designed to maintain balance could just as easily trigger wider conflict. Political stability often relied on delicate compromises, untested by real crisis. And leaders, confident in their control, grew increasingly willing to take risks, believing they could always manage the consequences. In private, some observers sensed the unease. A few writers warned that industrial war would be unlike anything humanity had seen. Some economists cautioned that rapid growth masked structural weaknesses. A handful of diplomats worried that pride and competition were replacing cooperation. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of factories, the applause of public optimism, and the comforting rhythm of routine. For the average citizen, life felt secure. Families planned futures around steady jobs. Investors trusted markets to rise. Nations trusted treaties to hold. The world moved forward, faster each year, convinced that momentum itself guaranteed safety. Few paused to ask whether civilization was racing toward a cliff rather than a horizon. History would later judge this era not as a time of true security, but as a moment of profound misunderstanding, a peak built on assumptions rather than certainty. The very forces that fueled prosperity also laid the groundwork for collapse. The belief that humanity had outgrown conflict would prove to be its most dangerous illusion. Because when the foundations of confidence finally cracked, the fall would not be gradual, it would be sudden, violent, and unforgettable, shattering forever the idea that progress alone could save the world.
Power, pride, and the cracks no one wanted to see. At the height of their power, the world's great empires appeared immovable. Maps painted them in confident colors, red, blue, gold, stretching across continents and oceans. To the public eye, these vast domains represented order, strength, and historical destiny. Generations had been taught that empires were the natural outcome of progress, proof that certain nations had mastered governance, industry, and civilization itself. Yet beneath the grandeur lay foundations far weaker than anyone cared to admit. Imperial power depended not only on military strength, but on the belief that authority was permanent. This belief became a dangerous form of pride. Rulers, politicians, and generals assumed that their systems, refined over centuries, were immune to collapse. They mistook endurance for invincibility. As long as borders held and flags flew, the deeper fractures, economic imbalance, political rigidity, and social unrest were easy to ignore. Colonial expansion played a central role in sustaining the illusion of strength.
empires extracted raw materials, labor, and wealth from distant lands to fuel their industrial cores. Colonies were presented as proof of global leadership, yet they were in truth sources of constant instability. Indigenous populations were ruled through force rather than consent, their cultures suppressed, their economies reshaped to serve foreign interests. Resistance was inevitable, but it was rarely acknowledged honestly. Instead, unrest was dismissed as temporary disorder, easily corrected through military action. This dependence on colonial wealth masked serious weaknesses at home. Industrial economies grew reliant on cheap resources and captive markets, discouraging reform and innovation. Political systems became rigid, designed to preserve elite power rather than adapt to change. As wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, inequality deepened, fueling resentment among workers and marginalized groups. The prosperity celebrated in capital cities often stood in sharp contrast to hardship in factories, farms, and forgotten neighborhoods. National pride intensified these vulnerabilities. Each empire measured itself against its rivals, not by the well-being of its people, but by territory, military size, and prestige. Diplomacy became a performance of strength rather than a tool for compromise. Leaders feared that any sign of restraint would be interpreted as weakness. As a result, escalation replaced negotiation, and caution gave way to bravado. Military institutions reflected this mindset. Armies and navies expanded rapidly, absorbing vast resources and reinforcing the belief that power could solve any problem. Technological advances promised quick victories and decisive outcomes. Strategists spoke confidently of short wars and controlled conflicts, convinced that superior planning and firepower would prevent chaos. Few considered how industrial-scale warfare might spiral beyond anyone's control. Meanwhile, internal divisions quietly deepened. Multi-ethnic empires struggled to maintain unity as nationalist movements gained momentum. Groups that had been governed for generations without representation began demanding autonomy, dignity, and self-rule. These demands were often met with repression rather than reform, further eroding loyalty to imperial centers. Instead of addressing legitimate grievances, authorities relied on censorship and force, convinced that order could be imposed indefinitely. Economic pressure added another layer of instability. Global markets tied imperial fortunes to volatile trade networks. A downturn in one sector could ripple across an entire empire. Governments borrowed heavily to maintain military readiness and social programs, creating financial systems vulnerable to crisis. Yet public discourse rarely acknowledged these risks. Confidence was official policy. The ruling classes were particularly resistant to uncomfortable truths. Surrounded by privilege and insulated from daily hardship, many leaders genuinely believed their own rhetoric. Advisors who warned of overextension or social unrest were dismissed as pessimists. Political careers depended on projecting strength, not honesty. In this environment, acknowledging weakness became more dangerous than ignoring it. The press and popular culture reinforced this denial. Newspapers celebrated imperial achievements and military displays, framing expansion as a moral mission. Schoolbooks portrayed empire as a civilizing force, minimizing violence and exploitation. Public ceremonies glorified the past, reminding citizens of historical victories while discouraging questions about the present. The narrative was clear. The empire was strong because it had always been strong. Yet history rarely rewards complacency. Power built on coercion demands constant reinforcement, and pride resists adaptation. As empires stretched themselves across continents, they became increasingly difficult to govern effectively. Communication delays, cultural misunderstandings, and administrative inefficiency undermined control. Decisions made in distant capitals often worsened local conditions, fueling further resentment. By the early years of the new century, the cracks were impossible to fully conceal. Labor strikes, political assassinations, and nationalist uprisings hinted at a deeper instability. Diplomatic crises erupted with alarming frequency, each one testing alliances and inflaming public opinion. Still, most leaders believed these were manageable problems, challenges to be overcome through resolve rather than reflection. The greatest danger lay in the empire's shared mindset. Each believed it could not afford to slow down, compromise, or retreat. Each feared falling behind rivals more than triggering catastrophe. This collective insecurity, masked by displays of confidence, created a volatile international environment where small provocations carried enormous consequences. What made the situation truly perilous was the gap between perception and reality. Citizens were told they lived within strong, stable systems, protected by tradition and power. In truth, those systems were brittle, sustained by force, debt, and denial. The strength of empires had become performative, convincing on the surface, hollow underneath. When the pressure finally came, it would expose these fragile foundations with brutal clarity. Empires that claimed permanence would struggle to survive. Structures built on pride would crack under strain, and the world would learn that power without humility and expansion without restraint leads not to security, but to collapse.
The hidden politics that reshaped the world. Publicly, the great powers of the world spoke the language of peace. Leaders shook hands beneath chandeliers, diplomats exchanged formal smiles, and treaties were signed with ceremonial pens. Newspapers reported stability, alliances, and mutual respect. To ordinary citizens, international politics appeared calm, even orderly. But behind closed doors, a very different world existed, one defined not by cooperation, but by suspicion, secrecy, and calculated deception. Diplomacy in this era was less about trust and more about advantage. Governments entered negotiations not to resolve conflicts, but to manage them quietly while preparing for future confrontations. Every agreement carried hidden clauses. Every promise was weighed against the possibility of betrayal. Alliances were formed with one hand, while contingency plans for war were drawn up with the other. The goal was not peace, it was control. Secret treaties became the currency of power. Nations bound themselves to mutual defense agreements that were never fully disclosed to the public or even to their own parliaments. Leaders believed secrecy provided security, allowing them to maneuver without public scrutiny. In reality, it created a web of obligations so complex that even those who designed it struggled to understand the consequences. A conflict in one corner of the world could trigger a chain reaction of commitments, dragging multiple nations into war without deliberate choice. These hidden agreements bred mistrust. Because no nation knew the full extent of another's alliances, each assumed the worst. Military planners prepared for scenarios based on fear rather than fact. Diplomatic conversations became exercises in performance, where reassurances masked underlying hostility. The absence of transparency made genuine compromise nearly impossible. Promises made to smaller nations were particularly fragile. Great powers offered protection, autonomy, or support, often as leverage against rivals, only to abandon those commitments when they became inconvenient. Borders were discussed and redrawn without the consent of the people who lived within them. Ethnic and cultural realities were ignored in favor of strategic advantage. These broken promises sowed resentment that would later erupt into violence. Colonial politics intensified the problem. Empires negotiated over territories as if they were pieces on a chessboard, trading control without regard for human cost.
Local leaders were promised independence or reform in exchange for loyalty, only to see those pledges quietly shelved once stability was restored. This pattern of manipulation deepened distrust not only between empires but between rulers and the ruled. Diplomatic deception was often justified as necessity. Leaders argued that the public could not handle the truth, that secrecy was required to maintain order. But this attitude eroded democratic accountability. Decisions of enormous consequence were made by small circles of elites, insulated from the consequences of failure. When crises emerged, citizens were expected to support policies they had never been allowed to debate. The press, constrained by censorship and national loyalty, rarely challenged official narratives. Journalists repeated government statements, reinforcing the illusion of honest diplomacy. When tensions escalated, blame was assigned selectively, obscuring the shared responsibility of multiple actors. The public, lacking access to full information, struggled to understand how peace could unravel so quickly. Personal ambition further distorted diplomacy. Statesmen sought legacy and prestige, believing bold moves would secure their place in history. Compromise was framed as weakness. Firmness, even recklessness, was praised. In this environment, negotiations became contests of will rather than problem-solving efforts. Each side believed it could outmaneuver the other without triggering disaster. Political conspiracies thrived in this atmosphere of secrecy. Intelligence agencies monitored allies as closely as enemies. Information was manipulated, selectively shared, or deliberately distorted to influence decisions. Rumors and half-truths guided policy as much as verified facts. Miscalculations multiplied, each one nudging the world closer to confrontation. The most dangerous aspect of these silent deals was the false sense of control they provided. Leaders believed they could calibrate conflict, limiting its scope and duration. They trusted that alliances would deter aggression rather than ignite it. Few imagined how quickly events could escape their grasp once the machinery of obligation and retaliation was set in motion. When a crisis finally emerged, the diplomatic system proved incapable of absorbing the shock. Secret commitments demanded action. Promises made in private overruled public hesitation. Governments mobilized not because they sought war, but because their hidden agreements left them no alternative. What had been designed as a deterrent became a trap. In retrospect, the tragedy lay not in a single act of betrayal, but in a culture of deception. By prioritizing strategy over sincerity, leaders undermined the very stability they claimed to protect. The world did not slide into conflict through ignorance alone, but through deliberate choices to conceal, manipulate, and postpone hard truths. The collapse of peace was swift, but its roots were deep. Silent deals and broken promises had hollowed out the foundations of international trust. When the moment of reckoning arrived, there was no shared understanding to fall back on, only fear, obligation, and the momentum of events already set in motion. History would later reveal the full extent of these hidden politics. Documents once sealed would expose the tangled web of alliances and betrayals that reshaped the world. By then, the cost was already paid, in lives lost, nations shattered, and a lesson written clearly enough for future generations to read, if they chose to look.
The warning signs ignored. Voices of reason drowned out by ambition. Long before the world descended into chaos, there were those who tried to stop it. They did not wear uniforms or command armies. They wrote, they spoke, they organized, and they pleaded. Their warnings appeared in newspaper columns, public lectures, private letters, and quiet conversations in cafes and classrooms. They saw what others refused to see.
that beneath the surface of prosperity and power, the world was drifting toward catastrophe. Intellectuals were among the first to raise the alarm. Economists warned that rapid industrial growth masked deep structural weaknesses. They pointed to unstable financial systems, widening inequality, and an unhealthy dependence on constant expansion. Philosophers questioned the moral cost of empire and militarism, arguing that technological progress had outpaced ethical responsibility. Historians reminded their audiences that histories before had also believed themselves immune to collapse until they were not. These voices were not radical. They did not call for revolution or chaos. They called for restraint, transparency, and humility. Yet their caution clashed with the dominant narrative of confidence. In an age that celebrated speed, strength, and certainty, doubt was unwelcome. Questioning progress was treated as disloyalty. Advocating moderation was framed as weakness. Journalists, too, sensed the danger. Some correspondents reported on the growing arms race, the aggressive tone of diplomatic exchanges, and the suffering in colonial territories. They described how nationalist rhetoric was hardening public opinion, making compromise politically risky. A few investigative reporters exposed secret agreements and political manipulation, urging readers to look beyond official statements. But these stories struggled to compete with spectacle. Military parades, technological exhibitions, and patriotic celebrations dominated headlines. Governments rewarded supportive media outlets with access and influence, while critical journalists faced censorship, intimidation, or professional isolation. In many countries, newspapers became extensions of national ambition rather than platforms for accountability. Ordinary citizens also felt the tension. Factory workers noticed rising prices and job insecurity. Parents worried as education systems glorified war and obedience rather than critical thinking. Veterans of earlier conflicts warned younger generations that war was not the adventure depicted in posters and speeches. In border regions and colonial territories, people lived daily with the consequences of imperial policies, understanding all too well how fragile peace really was. Yet these lived experiences rarely shaped policy. Power had become centralized, insulated from dissent by layers of bureaucracy and privilege. Decision-makers occupied a world of briefings and banquets far removed from the anxieties of everyday life. Surrounded by advisors who reinforced their assumptions, leaders came to believe that opposition voices were misinformed or exaggerated. Ambition played a crucial role in silencing warnings. Political careers depended on projecting confidence and control. Leaders feared that acknowledging risk would embolden rivals or undermine public support. As a result, they chose reassurance over realism. When confronted with evidence of instability, they promised that the situation was under control, that preparations were sufficient, alliances were secure, and progress would continue uninterrupted. This culture of denial extended to military planning. Strategists who questioned optimistic assumptions about quick victories or limited conflict were sidelined. War games and simulations were designed to confirm existing beliefs rather than test them. The possibility of prolonged, devastating warfare was acknowledged in private, then dismissed in public as unlikely. Education and popular culture reinforced the silence. School textbooks praised national achievements and minimized historical failures. Literature and theater often glorified sacrifice and heroism while avoiding the human cost of conflict. Young people absorbed these messages, growing up with a romanticized view of war and a simplified understanding of politics. What made the situation especially tragic was that the warnings were often accurate.
The economists were right about instability. The journalists were right about deception. The citizens were right about fear and injustice. But truth alone was not enough. It required courage to act on it, and courage was in short supply among those who had the most to lose. When dissent did break through, it was frequently mischaracterized. Critics were labeled pessimists, idealists, or even traitors. Their motives were questioned, their patriotism doubted. In some cases, governments passed laws restricting speech in the name of national security, further shrinking the space for honest debate. The message was clear: unity mattered more than truth. As tensions escalated, opportunities for change narrowed. Each crisis was treated as temporary, each escalation justified as defensive. Leaders convinced themselves that backing down would be more dangerous than pressing forward. The warnings that seemed urgent began to feel distant, drowned out by the noise of mobilization and rhetoric. In hindsight, this was the moment when disaster became inevitable, not because the future was unknowable, but because it was known and ignored. The world did not stumble blindly into conflict. It walked toward it with eyes open, choosing ambition over caution, pride over wisdom. When the breaking point finally came, many would claim surprise. They would say the war was unavoidable, that no one could have predicted its scale or intensity. But history would preserve the words of those who tried to warn them. Their essays, reports, and testimonies would remain as evidence that another path was possible. The tragedy of this era lies not only in the destruction that followed, but in the silence that preceded it. A silence created not by ignorance, but by the deliberate refusal to listen. Voices of reason were there, clear and persistent. They were simply drowned out by ambition, by fear, and by the comforting illusion that progress alone could protect the world from itself.
One event, endless consequences. History rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with warning bells or final chances. More often, it turns on a single moment, brief, almost ordinary, before revealing its true weight. For years, the world had balanced uneasily between confidence and fear, peace and preparation. Alliances strained, ambitions hardened, and warnings went unheard. All that remained was a spark. When it came, it did not look like the beginning of global collapse. The event unfolded in a place few outside the region could locate on a map. It was a city shaped by history, identity, and unresolved tensions, where empires overlapped and memories of past injustices lingered beneath everyday life. On the surface, it was just another day. Streets filled with people going about their routines. Cafes opened their doors. Flags hung quietly in the summer air. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. A single act of violence, targeted, deliberate, and symbolic, cut through the fragile calm. A prominent figure fell, not only as a man, but as a representation of power itself. The sound of gunfire echoed far beyond the street where it occurred, reverberating through chancelleries, military headquarters, and royal courts across the world. What had been theoretical danger became undeniable reality. News traveled faster than ever before. Telegraph wires carried the message across borders within hours. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Crowds gathered, stunned and uncertain. For ordinary citizens, the assassination was shocking but distant, another tragic headline in a world already full of them. For those in power, it was something else entirely. It was a test. In the days that followed, governments faced a choice: de-escalate or retaliate, investigate or accuse, restrain emotion or exploit it. Publicly, leaders called for calm. Privately, they calculated advantage. The event became a mirror, reflecting not what nations claimed to value, but what they feared losing. Political language hardened almost immediately. Words like justice, honor, and security filled speeches and statements.
masking deeper motives. Ultimatums were drafted with impossible demands. Diplomatic cables grew tense, their phrasing carefully designed to provoke without appearing responsible. Each decision narrowed the path back to peace. What made the moment so dangerous was not the act itself, but the context surrounding it. The world had been prepared for conflict long before the trigger was pulled. Military plans were already written, alliances were already bound, grievances were already cataloged. The assassination did not create hostility, it unlocked it. In capital cities, war councils convened behind closed doors. Generals argued that delay would signal weakness. Politicians feared public outrage if they appeared passive. Advisors warned of consequences, but their voices were overwhelmed by urgency and pride. No one wanted to be the leader remembered for hesitation. The media intensified the pressure. Headlines framed the event as an attack not just on an individual, but on national dignity. Editorials demanded action. Public mourning quickly turned into public anger, carefully guided by official narratives. The complexity of the situation vanished beneath emotional certainty. Someone had to be blamed and punished. Diplomacy still existed, but it had become performative. Messages were exchanged, meetings arranged, but trust was gone. Each side assumed the other was acting in bad faith. Even sincere efforts at compromise were interpreted as strategic delay. Time, once an ally of peace, became its enemy. As mobilization orders were prepared, the machinery of war began to move almost automatically. Trains were scheduled, factories shifted production, reservists received notices that would change their lives forever. The speed of these processes left little room for reflection. Systems designed for efficiency now worked against restraint. For ordinary people, the transition from peace to crisis was bewildering. One week, life followed familiar rhythms. The next, uncertainty dominated every conversation. Young men faced the prospect of battle before fully understanding why. Families gathered around radios and newspapers, searching for reassurance that never came. Some still believed the crisis would pass. They had seen scares before, diplomatic confrontations resolved at the last minute. Surely reason would prevail again. Surely leaders understood the cost of escalation. But this time was different, not because the stakes were higher, but because patience was gone. Each step toward conflict made the next one easier. Partial mobilization justified full mobilization. Defensive measures looked like preparation for attack. Fear fed on itself, reinforced by decades of mistrust and ambition. The moment demanded wisdom, but rewarded decisiveness instead. Behind the scenes, a few individuals recognized the danger. They urged caution, proposed compromises, suggested delays. Their efforts came too late. The momentum of events had overtaken individual agency. History had shifted into motion, and stopping it now required a courage that few possessed. When the first declaration came, it felt unreal. A formal announcement, delivered with legal language and ceremonial gravity, declared what many still hoped was impossible. War was no longer a threat, it was a fact. Alliances activated, and the conflict expanded outward like a shock wave, drawing in nations that had not chosen the moment but could not escape it. The world watched in disbelief as a regional crisis transformed into a global one. Borders hardened, trade routes closed, diplomatic channels collapsed under the weight of obligation and fear. Within weeks, the structures of peace that had taken generations to build were undone. In retrospect, historians would argue over responsibility. They would analyze documents, decisions, and timelines, searching for the precise moment when disaster became unavoidable. But the truth was simpler and more tragic. The world had been ready to burn long before the match was struck. The assassination was not the cause of collapse, it was the permission. It allowed leaders to act on long-held fears and ambitions. It gave moral cover to decisions already desired. It transformed preparation into justification. And once that transformation occurred, there was no turning back.
The moment that lit the fire lasted only seconds. Its consequences reshaped decades. By the time the flames were fully visible, spreading across continents and oceans, it was too late to ask what might have been done differently. The world had crossed a threshold, leaving behind the illusion of control and entering an age defined by destruction, sacrifice, and irreversible change. History would remember this moment not for what happened, but for what followed. An endless chain of consequences born from a single act, amplified by pride, fear, and the refusal to step back when stepping back still mattered.
Nations mobilized, humanity lost. When war was finally declared, it did not arrive all at once. It crept into daily life quietly, almost politely, before overwhelming everything. Governments issued statements, flags were raised, and patriotic speeches filled public squares. For many, the early days carried a strange mixture of fear and excitement. War was still an idea, distant and abstract, something that happened on maps and in headlines. Then the orders came. Across cities, towns, and rural communities, mobilization transformed society overnight. Train stations filled with men carrying small bags and heavy uncertainty. Uniforms replaced work clothes. Factory whistles that once signaled the start of ordinary shifts now marked the production of weapons and ammunition. Schools, churches, and community halls were repurposed for recruitment, training, and ration distribution. The rhythm of civilian life bent to the demands of conflict. For soldiers, the transition was brutal and immediate. Many had never traveled beyond their home regions, yet now found themselves transported across borders into unfamiliar landscapes. Training camps promised discipline and purpose, but could not prepare them for the reality ahead. Letters home were filled with reassurance, often more for loved ones than for themselves. Beneath the optimism, fear settled in quietly. The front lines shattered every illusion. Combat was chaotic, relentless, and deeply personal. Soldiers learned quickly that bravery did not guarantee survival, and that technology had turned battle into an impersonal slaughter. Artillery thundered day and night, erasing landmarks and time itself. The constant noise, the mud, the exhaustion, these became the soldier's world. Sleep came in fragments, hope in shorter supply. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had enlisted with confidence struggled with terror, guilt, and grief. They witnessed the sudden loss of friends, the randomness of death, the helplessness of survival. Silence after bombardment was often worse than the noise, filled with the unspoken knowledge of what might come next. The concept of heroism faded, replaced by the simple desire to endure another day. Back home, civilians fought a different kind of war. Families adjusted to absence and uncertainty. Mothers waited for letters that arrived sporadically, each envelope a fragile promise of life. Wives learned to manage households alone, balancing fear with responsibility. Children grew up faster, absorbing anxiety through whispered conversations and radio reports. Daily routines were reshaped by rationing, shortages, and constant reminders of sacrifice. Industry became the backbone of the war effort. Factories shifted entirely to military production, drawing in workers at unprecedented levels. Women entered industrial jobs in large numbers, redefining social roles and expectations. The war demanded efficiency, and society responded by reorganizing itself around production and endurance. Progress continued, but its purpose had changed, from improving life to sustaining destruction. Propaganda filled the airwaves and printed pages. Posters urged unity, courage, and vigilance. Governments framed sacrifice as noble and necessary, shaping public emotion to maintain support. Doubt was discouraged. Criticism was labeled unpatriotic. For many Americans, belief in the cause became a way to cope with loss, a shield against despair. Yet beneath the surface, the cost was undeniable. Communities mourned collectively. Casualty lists grew longer, names familiar. Funerals became frequent, somber reminders of the war's reach. Even those untouched by direct loss felt the weight of constant tension. The future narrowed to short-term survival. Long-term dreams were postponed indefinitely. The war also transformed social relations. Differences in class and background blurred in shared hardship, while new divisions emerged over policy, strategy, and justice. Minority communities, often asked to sacrifice without receiving equal rights, faced a painful contradiction. The promise of unity clashed with persistent inequality, raising questions that would outlast the war itself. For soldiers returning from the front, home no longer felt the same. The distance between civilian understanding and combat reality was vast. Words failed to capture experience. Silence became common. Many carried invisible wounds, struggling to reconcile what they had seen with the lives they were expected to resume. Society celebrated victory and valor, but often lacked the language or willingness to address trauma. As the conflict dragged on, initial enthusiasm faded. War weariness settled in. The idea of quick resolution vanished, replaced by grinding endurance. Each new offensive promised breakthrough. Each setback demanded more sacrifice. The human cost continued to rise, measured not only in lives lost, but in trust, innocence, and hope. Still, life went on. People adapted because they had to. Weddings were held during brief leaves. Birthdays were celebrated with rationed treats. Music, art, and humor survived as acts of quiet resistance against despair. These moments of humanity stood in sharp contrast to the violence surrounding them, reminders of what was at stake. By the time the war had fully consumed the world, it was clear that nothing would return unchanged. Nations might emerge stronger or weaker, borders might shift, and governments might fall. But the deeper transformation was human. An entire generation learned what it meant to live with uncertainty, loss, and moral complexity. For the American audience, the war became a defining experience, one that reshaped national identity and collective memory. It challenged assumptions about progress, security, and exceptionalism. It revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of a society under pressure. A world had been mobilized, and in the process, something essential was lost. Not all of it could be recovered. The war did not just destroy cities and armies, it altered how people understood life, duty, and the cost of ambition. When the guns finally fell silent, whenever that might be, the silence would not mean peace. It would mark the beginning of reckoning. Because the true impact of war never confines to the battlefield. It lives on in those who survived, in the choices societies make afterwards, and in the lessons they choose to remember or forget.
When technology outpaced morality. War does not only change borders, it changes priorities. Once the conflict began, progress itself was redefined. Innovation was no longer measured by how it improved life, but by how efficiently it could end it. Factories that once produced tools for building now worked day and night to perfect instruments of destruction. Industry became the engine of war, and technology its most obedient servant. The transformation was swift and relentless. Governments mobilized industrial power on an unprecedented scale. Civilian economies were reorganized almost overnight, redirected toward military necessity.
Assembly lines that had symbolized prosperity were repurposed to manufacture rifles, artillery, tanks, and shells by the millions. Efficiency became a moral justification in itself. If something could be built faster, stronger, or deadlier, it was considered progress, regardless of consequence. In the United States and across the industrialized world, innovation surged under pressure. Engineers, chemists, and scientists were summoned not to solve human suffering, but to outpace the enemy. Research laboratories became extensions of the battlefield. Breakthroughs that might have taken decades were achieved in years, even months. War rewarded speed, not reflection. New weapons reshaped the nature of combat. Artillery grew more powerful and precise, capable of destroying entire landscapes. Machine guns turned open ground into killing fields, rendering traditional tactics obsolete. Poison gas, once unthinkable, was deployed with clinical calculation, its effects slow, painful, and indiscriminate. The line between combatant and victim blurred as technology ignored intent and targeted bodies without distinction. Each innovation promised advantage, none promised mercy. What made this era especially unsettling was how quickly moral hesitation disappeared. Early objections to certain weapons were brushed aside as impractical or naive. Leaders argued that restraint would only invite defeat. If the enemy was developing a weapon, then developing it faster became a matter of survival. Ethics were reframed as obstacles rather than safeguards. The logic was seductive and dangerous. Responsibility for destruction was transferred from decision-makers to machines. Killing became impersonal, mediated by distance and technology. Soldiers fired shells they would never see land. Bombs were dropped from heights that made individual lives invisible. The human face of war faded behind calculations, coordinates, and production quotas. Industrial workers became participants in this system, often without fully realizing it. Men and women labored long hours in factories, proud to contribute to the war effort. Their work was framed as patriotic, essential, heroic, and in many ways it was. Yet each completed shift produced more tools designed to end lives. The emotional distance between creation and consequence allowed society to function without confronting the full weight of its actions. Technology also changed how suffering was measured. Casualty figures became statistics, updated regularly, abstracted from personal loss. Governments reported numbers, not names. The scale of destruction was so vast that individual tragedies blurred into collective data. Progress was charted in output and efficiency, while grief remained private. Medical innovation followed a similar path. Advances in surgery, trauma care, and prosthetics saved countless lives, but often to send survivors back into combat. Medicine became a means of sustaining war rather than preventing it. Doctors faced ethical dilemmas daily, balancing healing with the knowledge that recovery might lead patients back to violence. Communication technology accelerated the pace of conflict. Telegraphs, radios, and improved logistics allowed commands to travel instantly, compressing decision-making time. Leaders could order massive offensives from distant offices, removed from immediate consequences. Speed replaced deliberation, leaving little room to question whether an action should be taken, only whether it could be. The home front was shaped by this technological momentum. Propaganda leveraged mass printing, film, and radio to shape public opinion with unprecedented reach. Narratives were carefully engineered, emphasizing necessity and inevitability. Technology that could have informed was instead used to persuade. The public was encouraged to trust the machine of progress without examining its direction. Yet cracks appeared here. Some scientists grew uneasy with their contributions.
A few engineers questioned whether innovation without restraint was truly advancement. Their doubts were often dismissed as distractions. War demanded unity, not conscience. To hesitate was to endanger others, or so the argument went. The most troubling legacy of wartime innovation was how quickly extraordinary measures became normalized. Weapons introduced as temporary solutions remained in arsenals long after their initial justification faded. Industrial systems built for war were difficult to dismantle, their influence extending into peacetime economies and politics. Progress, once detached from morality, proved hard to realign. By the later stages of the conflict, it was clear that technology had reshaped not only warfare, but values. Efficiency overshadowed empathy. Victory justified methods. The idea that some actions were unacceptable under any circumstances grew increasingly fragile. Humanity had learned how to do things it had never paused to ask whether it should. For American society, this reckoning was especially complex. Innovation was a source of national pride, deeply tied to identity and optimism. The same ingenuity that built cities and industries had helped win wars, but at a cost that could not be easily quantified. Progress proved powerful, but not inherently wise. When the war eventually moved toward its conclusion, the technologies developed during its darkest moments did not disappear. They remained, silent reminders of choices made under pressure. The question lingered: had humanity mastered its tools, or had the tools begun to shape humanity? History would later celebrate many wartime innovations as milestones, but beneath the achievements lay a sobering truth. Progress without moral boundaries does not eliminate suffering, it scales it. Industry without restraint does not secure peace, it prepares the next conflict. The war revealed a fundamental imbalance. Technology had advanced faster than ethics, faster than collective understanding, faster than the capacity to absorb its consequences. In the race to win, humanity had outrun its own values. And that imbalance would not end with the war. It would echo into the future, shaping decisions yet to come, reminding the world that progress, when divorced from responsibility, carries a price far higher than any nation can afford.
Sacrifice, strategy, and the slow shift toward victory. For a long time, the war felt endless. Battles were fought, cities were lost and reclaimed, and casualty lists grew longer with every passing month. Victories were claimed, but none felt decisive. Each advance came at a terrible cost, and each setback threatened to erase hard-won gains. To those living through it, soldiers in the trenches, families on the home front, leaders burdened by impossible choices, the idea of victory seemed distant, almost abstract. And yet, history was already turning. The shift did not come from a single triumphant moment. It emerged slowly, unevenly, through a series of sacrifices and decisions that reshaped the balance of power. These moments were rarely celebrated when they occurred. Often they looked like desperation rather than progress. On the battlefield, strategy began to evolve out of necessity. Early assumptions about quick, decisive engagements had collapsed under the reality of industrial warfare. Commanders who survived learned painful lessons. Frontal assaults without coordination were suicide. Rigid plans could not survive changing conditions. Victory required patience as much as courage. New tactics emerged. Combined operations brought infantry, artillery, and emerging technologies into closer coordination. Timing mattered. Intelligence mattered. Adaptability became as important as firepower. These changes did not eliminate suffering, but they reduced waste, an acknowledgement, however limited, of the human cost already paid. Some battles, though costly, marked critical turning points. They exhausted enemy resources, disrupted supply lines, and shattered the myth of invincibility. Soldiers sensed the change before politicians did. They noticed longer pauses in enemy offensives, shortages of equipment, signs of strain in opposing ranks. The war was no longer one-sided endurance. It had become a test of who could last longer. Sacrifice defined this phase of the conflict. Entire units held their ground against overwhelming odds, buying time for broader strategic movements. Medical personnel worked under constant threat, refusing to abandon the wounded, even as shells fell nearby. Civilians endured bombing, hunger, and displacement, their resilience forming an invisible but essential front line. These sacrifices rarely made headlines, but without them, the tide would not have turned. Leadership, too, began to change, slowly, imperfectly. Some commanders were replaced after repeated failures. Others adapted, learning to listen to advisors and frontline reports rather than relying solely on doctrine. Political leaders faced with mounting losses and public pressure reconsidered priorities. The war effort became more focused, less driven by pride, and more by long-term objectives. In the United States, this shift carried particular weight. American involvement brought not only manpower, but industrial capacity and logistical coordination on a massive scale. Supply chains stabilized, troops arrived with fresh energy and resources. For exhausted allies, this presence was more than symbolic, it was transformative. American soldiers entered a war already scarred by years of attrition. They encountered landscapes torn apart by artillery, villages emptied by displacement, and allies hardened by prolonged loss. The learning curve was steep, paid for in blood. But their arrival altered momentum. The balance of endurance began to favor those who could sustain the fight economically as well as militarily. Morale, fragile and fluctuating, became a decisive factor. On one side, signs of progress, however small, rekindled hope. On the other, prolonged hardship eroded confidence. Desertions increased. Doubt spread quietly through ranks and populations alike. Wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with belief. When belief weakens, defeat follows. Strategic decisions off the battlefield mattered just as much. Control of resources, transportation routes, and communication networks proved decisive. Blockades tightened, alliances solidified or fractured. Diplomatic efforts focused less on preventing war and more on shaping its outcome. The conflict had become a struggle not just for territory, but for the post-war world. The human cost, however, remained staggering. For soldiers, each advance carried the memory of those who did not survive to see it. Victory felt incomplete, haunted by absence. Letters home grew quieter, heavier. Optimism was cautious, restrained by experience. No one spoke of glory anymore, only of survival and the hope that sacrifice might finally mean something. Civilians, too, felt the shift. Rationing intensified, war fatigue deepened. Yet there was a growing sense, subtle but real, that the suffering might lead somewhere, that endurance had purpose. Communities clung to this belief because without it, the cost would have been unbearable. What makes this turning point unique in history is how uncelebrated it was at the time. There were no grand announcements declaring the tide had turned. No single battle ended the war. Instead, the conflict began to tilt almost imperceptibly, like a scale responding to accumulated weight. Historians would later identify key moments, critical offensives, decisive decisions, pivotal alliances. But for those living through it, the change was felt emotionally before it was understood strategically. A sense that the enemy was no longer advancing, that losses, while still painful, were no longer futile. that the end, though distant, was no longer unimaginable. This phase of the war revealed a harsh truth about history. Progress often depends on sacrifice, but sacrifice alone is not enough. It must be paired with learning, adaptation, and restraint. The tide turned not because one side suffered more, but because one side began to use suffering more wisely, reducing waste, valuing coordination, and thinking beyond immediate pride. By the time victory began to feel possible, the world had already been transformed. Those who fought would never return to who they were before. Those who waited would carry scars of a different kind. Even triumph, when it came, would be complicated, shadowed by memory and loss. The turning of the tide did not bring relief. It brought responsibility. Responsibility to honor the sacrifices made. Responsibility to shape a peace worthy of the cost. Responsibility to remember that history does not turn easily, and that when it does, it demands a price measured not in territory or treaties, but in human lives. And as the war slowly moved toward its conclusion, one question loomed larger than victory itself: whether the lessons paid for so dearly would be remembered or forgotten once the fighting finally stopped.
When technology outpaced morality. War does not only change borders, it changes priorities. Once the conflict began, progress itself was redefined. Innovation was no longer measured by how it improved life, but by how efficiently it could end it. Factories that once produced tools for building now worked day and night to perfect instruments of destruction. Industry became the engine of war, and technology its most obedient servant. The transformation was swift and relentless. Governments mobilized industrial power on an unprecedented scale. Civilian economies were reorganized almost overnight, redirected toward military necessity. Assembly lines that had symbolized prosperity were repurposed to manufacture rifles, artillery, tanks, and shells by the millions. Efficiency became a moral justification in itself. If something could be built faster, stronger, or deadlier, it was considered progress, regardless of consequence. In the United States and across the industrialized world, innovation surged under pressure. Engineers, chemists, and scientists were summoned not to solve human suffering, but to outpace the enemy. Research laboratories became extensions of the battlefield. Breakthroughs that might have taken decades were achieved in years, even months. War rewarded speed, not reflection. New weapons reshaped the nature of combat. Artillery grew more powerful and precise, capable of destroying entire landscapes. Machine guns turned open ground into killing fields, rendering traditional tactics obsolete. Poison gas, once unthinkable, was deployed with clinical calculation, its effects slow, painful, and indiscriminate. The line between combatant and victim blurred as technology ignored intent and targeted bodies without distinction. Each innovation promised advantage, none promised mercy. What made this era especially unsettling was how quickly moral hesitation disappeared. Early objections to certain weapons were brushed aside as impractical or naive. Leaders argued that restraint would only invite defeat. If the enemy was developing a weapon, then developing it faster became a matter of survival. Ethics were reframed as obstacles rather than safeguards. The logic was seductive and dangerous. Responsibility for destruction was transferred from decision-makers to machines. Killing became impersonal, mediated by distance and technology. Soldiers fired shells they would never see land. Bombs were dropped from heights that made individual lives invisible. The human face of war faded behind calculations, coordinates, and production quotas. Industrial workers became participants in this system, often without fully realizing it. Men and women labored long hours in factories, proud to contribute to the war effort. Their work was framed as patriotic, essential, heroic, and in many ways it was. Yet each completed shift produced more tools designed to end lives. The emotional distance between creation and consequence allowed society to function without confronting the full weight of its actions. Technology also changed how suffering was measured. Casualty figures became statistics, updated regularly, abstracted from personal loss. Governments reported numbers, not names. The scale of destruction was so vast that individual tragedies blurred into collective data. Progress was charted in output and efficiency, while grief remained private. Medical innovation followed a similar path. Advances in surgery, trauma care, and prosthetics saved countless lives, but often to send survivors back into combat. Medicine became a means of sustaining war rather than preventing it. Doctors faced ethical dilemmas daily, balancing healing with the knowledge that recovery might lead patients back to violence. Communication technology accelerated the pace of conflict. Telegraphs, radios, and improved logistics allowed commands to travel instantly, compressing decision-making time. Leaders could order massive offensives from distant offices, removed from immediate consequences. Speed replaced deliberation, leaving little room to question whether an action should be taken, only whether it could be. The home front was shaped by this technological momentum. Propaganda leveraged mass printing, film, and radio to shape public opinion with unprecedented reach. Narratives were carefully engineered, emphasizing necessity and inevitability. Technology that could have informed was instead used to persuade. The public was encouraged to trust the machine of progress without examining its direction. Yet cracks appeared here. Some scientists grew uneasy with their contributions. A few engineers questioned whether innovation without restraint was truly advancement. Their doubts were often dismissed as distractions. War demanded unity, not conscience. To hesitate was to endanger others, or so the argument went. The most troubling legacy of wartime innovation was how quickly extraordinary measures became normalized. Weapons introduced as temporary solutions remained in arsenals long after their initial justification faded. Industrial systems built for war were difficult to dismantle, their influence extending into peacetime economies and politics. Progress, once detached from morality, proved hard to realign. By the later stages of the conflict, it was clear that technology had reshaped not only warfare, but values. Efficiency overshadowed empathy. Victory justified methods. The idea that some actions were unacceptable under any circumstances grew increasingly fragile. Humanity had learned how to do things it had never paused to ask whether it should. For American society, this reckoning was especially complex. Innovation was a source of national pride, deeply tied to identity and optimism. The same ingenuity that built cities and industries had helped win wars, but at a cost that could not be easily quantified. Progress proved powerful, but not inherently wise. When the war eventually moved toward its conclusion, the technologies developed during its darkest moments did not disappear. They remained, silent reminders of choices made under pressure. The question lingered: had humanity mastered its tools, or had the tools begun to shape humanity? History would later celebrate many wartime innovations as milestones, but beneath the achievements lay a sobering truth. Progress without moral boundaries does not eliminate suffering, it scales it. Industry without restraint does not secure peace, it prepares the next conflict. The war revealed a fundamental imbalance. Technology had advanced faster than ethics, faster than collective understanding, faster than the capacity to absorb its consequences. In the race to win, humanity had outrun its own values.
And that imbalance would not end with the war. It would echo into the future, shaping decisions yet to come, reminding the world that progress, when divorced from responsibility, carries a price far higher than any nation can afford.
What the past still tries to teach the modern world. History, when truly examined, does not simply vanish into textbooks or museum halls. It lingers in cities rebuilt over rubble, in monuments that mark sacrifice, in the subtle rhythms of societies still learning how to live with the consequences of choices made long ago. The wars, treaties, and struggles of the past, each decision, each miscalculation, each act of courage and folly remain written not just on paper, but in the very structure of the modern world. For contemporary America, and for the global order it helped shape, these lessons are both urgent and unavoidable. The conflicts that once convulsed continents left more than borders. They left patterns, patterns of ambition, fear, misjudgment, and unchecked power that continue to echo in the present. The same human impulses that fueled the battles of the early 20th century, national pride, technological fascination, political hubris, can still threaten stability today. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward preventing history from repeating itself. The first lesson is clear. Power without accountability is dangerous. The architects of past conflicts often acted from positions of immense authority, insulated from the consequences of their choices. Decisions made in war rooms, palace chambers, and diplomatic back offices set entire populations on paths they did not choose. Today, governments and leaders retain similar power over military action, technology, and global economics. Democracy, transparency, and vigilant civil society are not optional luxuries. They are essential safeguards against the same arrogance that once plunged the world into chaos. Another lesson emerges from the human toll of unchecked ambition. Progress without conscience is perilous. In earlier wars, industrial and technological innovation achieved unprecedented scale. Factories produced weapons faster than ethical frameworks could adapt. Medicine, engineering, and communications were harnessed to sustain conflict, often with little regard for human cost. Modern society faces similar challenges. Artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, biotechnology, and advanced weaponry have the potential to transform life, but without moral guidance, they can magnify harm. The past warns that technical skill is not equivalent to wisdom, and that innovation divorced from ethics can escalate faster than laws, treaties, or interventions. The fragility of alliances also stands out as a crucial lesson. In the early 20th century, entangling treaties and secret agreements dragged nations into conflicts they might otherwise have avoided. Today's global partnerships are complex, multifaceted, and often opaque. The lesson endures. Trust is fragile, and commitments require constant care. Diplomacy must be honest and transparent, and nations must guard against the blind execution of agreements without consideration for broader consequences. History shows that miscommunication, hidden agendas, or unexamined obligations can ignite disasters whose origins may seem distant and abstract. Equally critical is the reminder that the human cost of conflict transcends borders. Soldiers, civilians, refugees, and families paid the price of past wars in blood, trauma, and lost futures. Modern policymakers and citizens alike must never forget that behind statistics are lives, and that human suffering cannot be treated as collateral for national ambition. Lessons written in blood are lessons about empathy, responsibility, and the moral imperative to prevent unnecessary harm. The modern world also confronts echoes of the past in social and political instability. History demonstrates that victory on the battlefield does not guarantee justice, reconciliation, or long-term peace. After wars ended,
Treaties were often partial, reparations uneven, and grievances left unaddressed. Societies celebrated victory while ignoring systemic inequalities and unresolved tensions. Today, global conflicts, civil unrest, and humanitarian crises remind us that peace requires more than cessation of violence. It demands fairness, accountability, and foresight. Short-term wins cannot replace long-term stability. Cultural memory, too, plays a role in shaping the present. The stories of heroism and sacrifice from earlier conflicts remain essential, not for glorifying violence, but for guiding reflection. Monuments, memorials, and literature serve as warnings. Ambition and pride, when left unchecked, bring ruin. Public education and discourse must confront uncomfortable truths honestly, cultivating citizens capable of critical thinking, moral judgment, and historical awareness. Lessons written in blood are only valuable if they are remembered, taught, and internalized. Technology once again offers both promise and peril. Past wars demonstrated that advances in science amplify both creation and destruction. Modern America, a nation at the forefront of innovation, bears a responsibility to consider not only what can be done, but what should be done. Cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and global communication networks provide extraordinary capabilities, but also raise ethical and strategic dilemmas. The past reminds us that speed, efficiency, and capability are insufficient measures of progress. Restraint, ethics, and human judgment must guide deployment. Furthermore, the interconnectedness of the modern world mirrors the entangled alliances of previous centuries. Economic, political, and environmental systems are deeply interwoven. Decisions made in one region can ripple globally, producing consequences unforeseen and often irreversible. History teaches that myopic nationalism, reactive decision-making, and hubris can escalate local conflicts into global crises. In a world where consequences travel faster than ever before, the lessons of the past are more relevant than they have ever been. Perhaps most fundamentally, the past insists on humility. History's bloodiest lessons are reminders that human ambition alone cannot ensure order, justice, or peace. Leaders, policymakers, and citizens must recognize the limits of power, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the weight of unintended consequences. Modern America, with its influence on global politics, trade, and security, carries the dual burden of opportunity and responsibility. A failure to learn from history risks repeating the very errors that history has already written in blood. The narrative of human conflict also highlights the role of individual and collective moral courage. Those who warned of danger, advocated for restraint, or acted to mitigate suffering often went unheard or were marginalized. Today, their lessons remain relevant. Dissent, debate, and conscientious action are essential to preventing catastrophe. Citizens who question, leaders who reflect, and societies that balance ambition with ethics form the essential safeguards against repeating the tragedies of the past. The culmination of these lessons is both cautionary and aspirational. The story of earlier conflicts, wars that consumed empires, shattered families, and reshaped continents, demonstrates the fragility of civilization. It illustrates the human capacity for both ingenuity and cruelty. It underscores that survival is not synonymous with morality, that victory is hollow without justice, and that progress without conscience carries hidden costs. Modern society, standing atop the accumulated consequences of previous generations, must confront these truths directly. For America, these lessons take on an urgent immediacy. As a global leader, its decisions reverberate across continents. Domestic policies, military strategies, and technological initiatives have implications far beyond national borders. The mistakes of the past offer a mirror.
They demand that ambition be tempered by foresight, that security be pursued alongside justice, and that power be exercised with humility. Failure to heed these lessons risks repeating the very errors that history has already written in blood. In the end, the past offers both warning and wisdom. History's tragedies are permanent reminders that human choice shapes destiny. Every technological advancement, every political decision, every act of moral courage or failure contributes to the unfolding story. For the modern world, and for America in particular, the challenge is to act with awareness, responsibility, and ethical clarity. The lessons of blood, sacrifice, and ambition remain. They are indelible, unchanging, and urgent. The echoes of past wars, of ambition unchecked, justice deferred, and humanity strained, resonate in the global dilemmas of today. Environmental crises, regional conflicts, and the proliferation of destructive technologies all test the